Chapter 25 Talk of the Town. Midway through Jim Williams' second year in jail, Savannah more or less forgot about him. The city turned its attention to other topics. There was a good deal of talk, for example, about the divine intervention allegedly visited upon George Mercer III. George Mercer III was a prominent businessman and nephew of the late Johnny Mercer. Mr. Mercer was leaving his house in Ardsley Park one evening to go to a dinner party when he suddenly realised he'd forgotten his car keys. He went back inside to get them. In the front hall, he heard a voice say loud and clear, "George, you drank too much." Mr. Mercer looked around, but the hall was empty. "Who are you?" he asked, "and where are you?" "I am the Lord," said the voice. "I am everywhere." "Well, I know I drink more than I should," said Mr. Mercer, "but how do I know you're the Lord? If you really are, show me. Show me now. If you can prove to me you're God, I'll never drink again." Suddenly Mr. Mercer felt himself being lifted high in the air, up over his house, up over Ardsley Park. He was lifted so high he could look down and see all of Savannah, the downtown squares, the river, Tybee Island, and Hilton Head. And the voice said, "Have I proved to you that I am real?" Mr. Mercer declared then and there that he did believe, and the Lord put him down back in the front hall. George Mercer III never took another drink after that. Even people who doubted the truth of that story had to admit that on a spiritual level at least, something very strange was happening to Savannah's upper crust. How else could one explain the charismatic services Thursday night at Christ Episcopal Church? Christ Church was Savannah's oldest and most tradition-bound house of worship. It was the mother church of Georgia, John Wesley having served as its rector in 1736. But now, the charismatics had a foot in the door, and they were gathering in the basement on Thursday nights, speaking in tongues, strumming guitars, banging tambourines, and waving their arms in the air whenever the Spirit moved them. The more conservative parishioners were appalled. Some simply refused to believe it. Spiritual matters were not Savannah's only preoccupation, however. There was concern about the city's economy as well. Savannah's renaissance had crested, and a decline had begun. The city seemed more isolated than ever. Northern businesses were locating in the south, but they were putting down roots in Atlanta, Jacksonville, and Charlestown, not Savannah. Downtown real estate values, after rising sharply for 20 years, had softened. Retail stores were abandoning Broughton Street and moving out to the Mall and elsewhere on the south side. More ominous yet, it seemed Savannah's most lucrative source of income, the shipping business, was on the verge of being choked off by, of all things, the old Talmadge Bridge. As tall as the bridge was, it was not quite tall enough to allow the huge new superfreighters to sail under it to the docks upriver. Several new medium-sized container ships had already clipped off aerials and radar masts on the underside of the bridge, and port officials dreaded that any day now a whole poop deck would be sheared off into the water. Before that ever happened, of course, a fair portion of Savannah's shipping trade would have headed for other ports. The threat to the economy of Savannah and Georgia was grave enough to send the state's congressional delegation scrambling in search of federal funds for a new bridge. After a period of tense negotiation, money was allowed, After a period of tense negotiation, money was allotted and a potential calamity averted. Fears about the old bridge were replaced by curiosity about what the new one would look like. With matters like these to talk about, there was little time for thoughts of Jim Williams. "After all," sighed Millicent Moreland, "what else is there to say about poor Jim?" Indeed, a more immediate concern was the sudden appearance on downtown walls, sidewalks, and dumpsters of graffiti that read, A disturbed Jennifer. The desperate nature of the scrawl suggested that a deranged woman was roaming the lanes, contemplating harm to herself or others. After a month of heightened anxiety and double locking of doors, a disturbed Jennifer materialized as a rock group composed of 4 green-haired students from the Savannah College of Art and Design. The resolution that the mystery calmed fears, but did nothing to soothe Savannah's. The resolution of that mystery calmed fears, but did nothing to soothe Savannah's increasing impatience with the new art school. The Savannah College of Art and Design, known familiarly as SCAD, had opened its doors in 1979 with the blessings of all of Savannah. The school had taken over the boarded-up Guard Armory on Madison Square and refurbished it as classrooms and studios for 71 art students. Within 2 years, enrollment had climbed to 300, and the college had acquired and restored several more old and empty buildings. Warehouses, public schools, even a jailhouse. SCAD's young president, Richard Rowan, let it be known that the student body would eventually grow to 2,000. Downtown residents did not respond happily to Rowan's announcement. While the students did contribute something to the local economy, and they did bring a little life to the otherwise empty streets, they were becoming, in the eyes of some people, a blight on the landscape with their green hair, odd clothes, skateboards, and their tendency to play loud music on the stereos well into the night. In reaction, a group of downtown residents formed a quality of life committee to deal with the situation. Joe Webster, who was heading the committee, could be seen every day at noontime walking stiffly with the aid of a cane from his office in the C&S Bank building to the Oglethorpe Club for lunch. His route took him down Bull Street, past the main entrance of SCAD, where he would invariably make his way through a small cluster of students and point silently with his cane at some offending object, a crumpled candy wrapper or a motorcycle idly noisy. His route took him down Bull Street, past the main entrance of SCAD, where he would invariably make his way through a small cluster of students and point silently with his cane at some offending object, a crumpled candy wrapper or a motorcycle idling noisily at the curb. On one occasion, Mr. Webster and his committee stopped in to see Richard Rowan in his office to express their concerns that the fragile human ecology of downtown Savannah might not survive 2,000 students. The total population of the historic district was, after all, only about 10,000. Rowan told the committee that he would see what he could do about the loud music, and that, by the by, he had recently revised his goal from 2,000 students to 4,000. However disruptive the college might have been to Savannah's peace and quiet, it did nothing to harm the city's physical beauty. The college restored each building it bought with taste and authenticity, and Savannah continued to receive compliments from its far-flung admirers. Le Monde called Savannah la plus belle de ville d'Amérique du Nord. The National Trust for Historic Preservation focused a flattering spotlight on the city when it bestowed its highest honour, the Louise Crowninshield Award, on Lee Adler for his contribution to Savannah's restoration. Adler went to Washington to accept the award, and upon his return his fellow citizens rallied around him in customary fashion. They congratulated him for winning yet another great honour, and as soon as his back was turned, they bitterly denounced him for once again hogging sole credit for a job done by many. While Savannah had grown accustomed to receiving compliments for its good looks, the city was thoroughly unprepared for a shockingly negative piece of news about itself that came howling out of the FBI in Washington and resounded around the world. Savannah had achieved the highest per capita murder rate in the United States the previous year, 54 murders, or 22.6 murders per 100,000 people. Savannah had become the murder capital of the United States. A stunned Mayor John Rousakis looked at the figures and complained that Savannah had been the victim of a statistical fluke. The numbers reflected murder rates in metropolitan areas. Unlike most cities, Savannah did not have vast outlying suburbs with thousands of untroubled suburbanites to dilute its murder rate. When the murder rate was confined to actual city limits, Savannah ranked 15th in the nation, which was still a troubling distinction for a city that was not even among the country's 100 largest cities. Intending to clarify the matter, the city manager, Don Mendoza, announced that a breakdown of police figures showed that crime in Savannah is a black problem. Nearly half of Savannah's population was black, he said, but 91% of the murderers were black, and 85% of the victims were also black. The same was true for rape. 89% of the offenders and 87% of the victims were black. 94% of assaults and 95% of robberies involved black offenders. The city manager was not a racist. He expressed a compassionate concern for dealing with the root cause. 12.1% unemployment among blacks compared with 4.7% for whites, and similar disparities in school dropout rates, teen pregnancies, unwed mothers and family income. Although racial inequalities were, if anything, greater in Savannah than in other southern cities, Savannah's blacks displayed surprisingly little hostility towards whites. On the surface, at least, a remarkable civility prevailed. A black man passing a white stranger on the street would likely to nod and say, "Good morning, how are you?" or simply, "Hey." Outwardly, little seemed to have changed since William Makepeace Thackeray visited Savannah in 1848 and described it as a tranquil old city with wide, tree-planted streets and a few happy Negroes sauntering here and there. Thackeray was not the only person to notice that slaves had smiles on their faces. W. H. Pearson wrote in The Water Witch in 1863, "The slaves are, by all odds, the happiest looking folks in the Confederacy. They sing, while the whites curse and pray." During slavery, it was thought by some observers that the apparent good cheer of the slaves had something to do with their expectation that the roles would be reversed in the hereafter. They would be the masters, and the whites would be the slaves. In the 1960s, the civil rights struggle put a temporary strain on relations, but integration was peaceful on the whole. Since then, Savannah had been governed largely by moderate whites who made it their business to stay on good terms with the black community. As a result, racial peace was maintained, and blacks remained politically conservative, which is to say passive. There was no discernible black activism in Savannah, but it was evident that underneath their apparent complacency, Savannah's blacks were beset by an anguish and despair that ran so deep it expressed itself with such violence that it had made Savannah the murder capital of America. If Savannah's spiritual, economic, artistic, architectural, and law and order concerns were not enough to keep people's minds off Jim Williams, there were plenty of distractions on the social scene. There was talk, for instance, about a standoff at the Married Women's Card Club. Slots for membership had opened up, but competition to fill them had become so fierce that every candidate had been blackballed for 2 years running. No one had gotten into the club in all that time, and for the first time in memory, membership had slipped below the mandated 16. The stalemate was temporarily upstaged by a food poisoning scare at one of the club's get-togethers. The ladies were just heading home at 6 o'clock when they discovered the hostess's cat lying dead on the front steps. Someone recalled having seen the cat nibbling a leftover portion of crab casserole only minutes before. The women thereupon trotted to their cars and drove in swarm to Candler Hospital to have their stomachs pumped. The following morning, the next-door neighbour stopped by to say he was sorry he'd run over the cat. Neither the Married Women's Membership Club Neither the Married Women's Membership Crisis nor the food scare received any mention in the newspaper's society column. It was, in fact, at about this time that the newspaper announced it was discontinuing its society column altogether. The column had never been much more than a bland recitation of guest lists, but its disappearance provoked a stinging rebuke from one of Savannah's leading socialites, Miss Vera Dutton Strong. In her letter to the editor, which was one of the longest the newspaper had ever published, Mrs. Strong expressed shocked disbelief at the cancellation of the column, calling the paper's social coverage a genuine disgrace. There was a certain irony in this, because the most compelling social group at the moment happened to be the test of wills currently being waged by Mrs. Strong and her rebellious daughter Dutton. Vera Dutton Strong was an heiress to a huge Dutton pulpwood fortune. An only child, she was a member of one of Savannah's richest society families. Her mother and father had always dressed for dinner, black tie and evening gown. Throughout her childhood she had been known as the Princess, a nickname that seemed only natural for her. She was debutante of the year, and at her wedding she wore an exact replica of the gown Queen Elizabeth II had worn at her wedding. Over the years, Mrs. Strong had shown herself to be a good-humoured, warm-hearted, and strong-willed. She was a founder of the Savannah Ballet Company and served as its hovering benefactress. Each year, just before the cotillion ball, society mothers would send their debutante daughters to Vera Strong so she could teach them how to curtsy properly. A cloistered Savannian of the purest sort, Mrs. Strong had never been to Europe, and she was past 50 when she visited Charlestown for the first time. Mrs. Strong's own daughter, Dutton, was an angel-faced beauty with long red hair and not the slightest inclination to be a princess or a ballerina, both of which Mrs. Strong had set her heart on. Dutton obediently started ballet class at the age of 4, and soon she was dancing with her mother's ballet company. Dutton's debutante party was the only one ever held at the Telfair Museum. Vera Strong hired Peter Dutton and his orchestra and commissioned a 12-foot ice sculpture of the Eiffel Tower to highlight the April in Paris theme of the party. It was not until Dutton went away to school that a streak of independence began to assert itself. She skipped classes, stopped dancing, and finally dropped out of school. She came back home to Savannah, where she spent a year aimlessly hanging around the house and doing battle with her mother. "I never wanted to be a ballerina," Dutton would bellow. "You're the one that wanted me to be a ballerina." But Mrs. Strong would have none of it. "That's nonsense. You love dancing, or you'd have never been so good at it." After one particularly energetic quarrel, Dutton stormed out of the house and moved into an apartment with an older woman who had been her mother's poodle breeder. Dutton cut her long hair short, took to wearing jeans instead of skirts, put on weight, and stopped wearing lipstick. Then one afternoon she came to see her mother to announce that she had at long last decided on a career. She would go to the police academy and become a Savannah cop. Vera Strong took the news with uncharacteristic calm. "If that's what you really want," she said, "I pray it turns out to be everything you're hoping for." Mrs. Strong attended her daughter's graduation at the police academy with a pasted-on smile. She wore the same smile at Christmas dinner when her daughter, the former ballerina debutante, arrived wearing a navy blue polyester pantsuit with a .38 revolver on one hip and a mace cannon handcuffs on the other. Refusing to admit defeat, Vera Strong decided to view her daughter's choice of profession as a selfless gesture of civic mindedness rather than a betrayal of the family heritage. In spring, she called the Oglethorpe Club to reserve a table for Easter dinner, making a point of telling the club manager that Dutton would be going on duty immediately afterward and would therefore be in uniform. Sensing a crisis of protocol, the manager demurred and said he would have to confer with the board. 10 minutes later, he called back with a profound apology. The no trousers rule for women had never been lifted before, and the board dared not to do it now. Mrs. Strong forthwith denounced the manager, the board, and the Oglethorpe Club, as only she could do. She then slammed down the telephone and booked a table at the more amenable but less exclusive Chatham Club. The Savannah Morning News proved to be more tractable than the Oglethorpe Club. Stung by Mrs. Strong's vituperative letter, the paper reinstated its society column. Understandably, the column never made reference to the red-headed ballerina and her astonishing leap from Capella to Cop, or to the continuing anguish that it caused her mother. While all of this was going on, the controversy over Joe Odom and the Hamilton Turner House continued unabated. Shortly after Joe set up the non-profit Hamilton Turner Museum Foundation to shield his illegal tour business, his neighbours countered by arguing before the Department of Inspections that, profit or non-profit, the Hamilton Turner House stood within 100 yards of a school. This meant it was illegal for Joe to sell liquor at his luncheons and dinner parties. But Joe was not concerned. "The law says I can't sell liquor," he says. "It doesn't say I can't serve it." Somewhere in the grey area between selling and serving, Joe knew how to make money giving liquor to his customers, and he went right on doing it. Liquor also played a part in the small drama involving Serena Dawes. Serena and Luther Driggers had split up, and Serena had taken to cruising the docks late at night in an effort to pick up Greek sailors. One night the police spotted her driving erratically along River Street and stopped her. Serena opted for a pose of elegant femininity, which was a feat in itself since she was wearing a shorty nightgown and fluffy white rabbit head slippers. She batted her eyelashes and exclaimed sweetly that she had gone out to move with her kawa and had gotten lost. When the policeman took her to the county jail and booked her for driving under the influence, she wanted to scream and scratch their faces, but instead she held herself in check and coyly thanked them for coming to her rescue. She mentioned that her great-granddaddy-in-law had been ambassador to the court of St. James's, just to let them know that they were dealing with a woman of quality. An hour later, Luther Driggers came down to bail her out, but by that time Serena had had enough of pretense. A fat black prison matron who had taken Serena's handbag and searched it now handed it back to her. "You can have it back," the matron said. "It's clean." "It's not clean anymore," Serena snapped, snatching the purse out of the woman's hands. "And if I ever catch you putting your filthy fucking hands on anything of mine again, you'll be wearing your poontang for a turtleneck." These, then, were the matters of consuming interest in Savannah, the city Le Mode had called La Plus Belle de Vie in North America. Beautiful as it was, but very isolated, and because of that a bit too trusting. Police had recently circulated a warning about a pair of con men who were cashing checks drawn on a non-existent company. The con men had given their victims a sporting chance by naming their bogus company Fly By Night Incorporated, but dozens of Savannah merchants had cashed the checks anyway. About the same time, it also came to light that the clerk in charge of handling the money in probate court did not know how to multiply, and that one of the probate judges had taken advantage of the situation by dipping into the cash box. Life, in other words, went on. Savannah had community questions to resolve, such as, should a second mall be built? Had Mr. Charles Hall ruined Whitfield Square by painting his gingerbread house a dozen shades of pink and purple? And if so, did the city have a right to force him to repaint it in more acceptable colours? Then one day in June, all of these questions were overshadowed by the news that the Georgia Supreme Court had once again overturned Jim Williams' conviction for murder. The court cited two reasons for setting aside the conviction. First, it ruled that Judge Oliver should not have allowed a Savannah police detective, to testify as an expert for the prosecution on points of evidence that the jurors were competent to evaluate on their own. The smeared blood on Danny Hansford's hand, the chair on his pants cuff, the fragments of paper on top of the gun. Second, the court faulted Spencer Lawton for waiting until his closing argument to demonstrate that the trigger on Hansford's gun was easy to pull rather than difficult, as the defence had claimed. In effect, said the court, Lawton's demonstration introduced new evidence which should have been brought up during the trial itself, at which time the defence could have responded to it. Williams was lucky. The reversal had been a 4-3 decision. The 3 dissenting justices argued that the errors had been harmless ones, and that, in any case, they had not influenced the verdict. But none of that mattered now. Since the state Supreme Court had not found Williams innocent, they had merely thrown out the verdict. Murder charges still stood against him. He would be tried a 3rd time in Judge Oliver's court, and a 3rd jury would deliver yet another verdict. Williams emerged from the Chatham County Jail a little thinner than before, a little greyer at the temples, and ghostly pale from having been inside for nearly 2 years. He squinted in the sun. As he and Sonny Seiler walked to a car parked at the curb, a small group of reporters and cameramen followed them along, shouting questions. Did Williams think he would be acquitted at the 3rd trial? Yes, of course, he said. What would be the deciding factor? Money, he said. My case has been about money from the very beginning. The DA spends the taxpayers' money, and I spend my own. $500,000 of it so far. The criminal justice system is rigged in that way, in case you haven't noticed. I'd still be in jail if I hadn't been able to pay for lawyers and experts and their endless expenses. So far, I've managed to stay even with the prosecution. Dollar for dollar, tit for tat. As he approached the car, Williams looked across Monterey Square and saw an old black woman standing at the bus stop. She was staring in his direction through purple glasses. Williams met her glance briefly and smiled, then turned back to the reporters. Well, maybe I shouldn't have said tit for tat. As I've always said, there are forces working in my favor. Forces the DA don't know nothing about. And what might they be? You can put them down under the heading of miscellaneous, he said. Within minutes, Jim Williams was back in Mercer House, back in the news, and back on people's minds again, whether they liked it or not.